why are prepositions so difficult?
I have heard that prepositions are the hardest thing in a foreign language to get right.
I'm not surprised. They have their own life in Arabic.
It depends on what language you're coming from. So people that are coming from a Slavic language like Bosnian, which doesn't have articles, that person can master everything in English, including the seemingly more difficult things like prepositions, but yet they still have trouble with articles, which is the simplest thing, simply because they don't have a concept of an article in their language.
Yeah, exactly. They've never experienced it in their own language.
Jose Nasser once, actually more than once, remarked to me that his experience was the most difficult thing to learn in English was the use of the word the. And learning Arabic as I am, I understand exactly what he means.
When I'm editing ESL English, I always try to formulate a rule to myself, at least, to explain why I've made a change. And the hardest rules to formulate, even in my own mind, are the rules about articles. I try never to default to, I don't know, it just doesn't sound right. But sometimes that's the best we can do.
While we're on this subject, Abby, can you straighten me out on it's ITS and IT apostrophe S?
Yeah. The reason that confuses people is that usually you use an apostrophe for possessive, but you also use it for contractions. So to distinguish the possessive from the contraction, the apostrophe is left off for the possessive. But it doesn't make any sense logically. That's why it's so confusing to people.
That's the part I was waiting for, Abby.
It breaks the rules.
Right.
So if you're talking about, that's right. It is funny. I guess that's the only word I know of that.
Well, theirs and hers also don't have apostrophes. The only possessive pronoun with an apostrophe is one's.
All right.
I knew I could count on you, Abby.
Isn't language fun?
Yeah, I love it.
The other thing is, you always hear that Arabic is a logical language, but it's not. I mean, Quranic Arabic is logical only because it's such a tiny, tiny subset of the language, and all of the grammar books were based on it. So it's logical post facto. But on the other hand, modern Arabic isn't logical at all. It has just as many exceptions, if not more, than English, depending on the dialect.
I'm not surprised.
Yes, maybe more. Basically, it is very logical. It's almost algebraic in its basic structure, except for the exceptions. And then you have to worry about gender and number and gender. And that changes whether you're above 10 or below 10 and things like that.
Really? Above and below 10, not just 1 versus 2 or more?
Well, below 10, you use the plural. Above 10, you use the singular, for example. And in the teens, it's the numbers digit that has to agree with the gender of what you're numbering. But below that, it has to be the opposite gender.
Right. And then with verb conjugation, it's all based on a pattern. It's all regular, except there's 42 patterns. And on top of that, there's about 2,000 exceptions to the 42 patterns. And forming a plural is even worse because there aren't any patterns and you just have to memorize every single plural with the noun. And the only irregularity is regular. And the only thing that's truly irregular are the few hundred nouns that form plurals regularly.
Couldn't have said it better, Seda, thank you. And the thing I have no comprehension of and find completely mysterious is how one deals with a language that is ideographic rather than phonetic.
Yes. By the way, Icelandic is unusual language in some respects.
Well, maybe I can learn it while I'm there.
Icelandic is actually very easy. I was learning a bit of Old Norse because I'm a weird geek like that, because so much of the roots of English go back to the Danish invaders, and Danish at that time was essentially Old Norse, and Icelandic is descended from that. It has a lot of similarities to English. It's just, has more complications like most older languages do, but nothing that a speaker of German would have any trouble with. So it's not particularly difficult. On the other hand, if you want a language that really boggles the mind, it's not actually one of the ideographic languages like Japanese, because the difficulty there is in its difference from English, not in its inherent complexity. Japanese or Chinese they're some of the simplest languages grammatically. But if you want a complicated language, go to something like Finnish or Hungarian. They have 32 cases, I think, in the case of Finnish and 64 in the case of Hungarian. And some of the words can get up to, 50 or 60 characters long because it glutenizes. So I can't make heads or tails of those languages. And it's really remarkable for me, when someone who's not a native speaker can learn any of that, because I've tried to learn Finnish and I'm okay with Arabic and I'm really good with German and a few other things. I even speak some Klingon, but Finnish is beyond me.
Interesting. I seem to remember hearing that, no, not Ethiopian. It's one of the European Baltic states, maybe?
Estonian?
Yes, that's the one I was trying to think of.
Estonian is essentially Finnish with some minor differences.
Oh, all right. It's another Hyperborean language.
Yes. And then, I was talking to a British friend a few weeks ago, and we were talking about language, and he said, he considers, and it's not surprising coming from a born and bred Englishman, but he said, Welsh is a language with a severe deficiency of vowels.
Well, I've heard that there are a lot of missing vowels in Moroccan Arabic too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I was learning Moroccan Arabic, I felt like I was having to talk with a potato in my mouth sometimes. I'm all consonants streaming together without any vowels to wet the tongue.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm glad I started this little diversion on language. It's been interesting.
Yes, language is one of the most interesting things I know of. I guess because it's a special kind of form that consciousness takes.
Yes. Theta Badria, can you appraise us of the doctrine Coomaraswamy introduced in The Bugbear of Literacy?
It's been, I think, 23 years since I've read that book.
It's only been 23 years.
Well, I thought it was basically the notion that ever since we became literate, our memories have suffered. I know that's the
I think
thing.
that was part of it, but I wonder if there's more to it than that.
Yeah, there might have been. I don't remember either.
I mean, interestingly enough, in the book that I'm writing, I just sent Sidi Izzadeen a chapter to edit where I was talking about precisely this, that, the more we become devoted to typing, less we're able to think in a certain way. When you're writing in a tactile way, you don't just think with your brain, but you think with your body. Also, when you're reading things on screens and such, it's a buffer between you, just like books are a buffer.
Right.
It's just one level upon another. And as soon as, we had the mass ability of printed books, memories essentially started to be decreased because it wasn't needed as much. In the few places in recent times that still had a largely oral culture, such as Tibet prior to the Chinese invasion, people would have 20,000 pages worth of stuff memorized. And these are illiterate people that would memorize it by hearing it recited over and over and over again.
Right.
And today, people are, having phones that are essentially their memories, and young people are having what has been termed in the medical community digital dementia because they're not actually exercising their brains enough. And I think that that's actually very disturbing.
Yeah, it's only going to get worse. Once there's a really good version of the metaverse or something like it, it's going to be like people lost in their screens. That was a feature of Fahrenheit 451, wasn't it? Being addicted to watching the big screen TVs or whatever they were. But it's, immersive. I mean, think of all the things that get virtualized that otherwise you only know as physical. It could be our ruination.
Wouldn't surprise me. But there's something more fundamental. I'm reaching at this, but I'm trying to draw the analogy about what is it that children lose when they begin to learn language and think in words.
Maybe that's the beginning of the loss of wonder.
The interesting thing about words is that has anyone read Temple Grandin?
I've actually met Temple Grandin.
Oh, that's wonderful. I remember in her most well-known, for those who don't know, she's an autistic person who writes about what it's like to be autistic because she's able to express herself well in writing. It gives us a window into her world. And she said that, I don't know if this is true of all autistic people, but she said if you say door to her, she doesn't have any general concept of a door. Her mind flips through all the doors that she's ever seen. And I thought that makes sense because the word door doesn't refer to any particular door. It refers to a universal that doesn't exist. And that's quite a big abstraction. And when children first begin to speak, they understand every word as a name. So if you give them a ball and say, this is a ball, they think that the word applies to that one thing and that's its name. And then at a certain point, about 1.5 and 2, they get the concept of generality and they start. I remember my first child in the supermarket, in the produce section, looking at the oranges and grapefruits and apples and saying, ball, 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 naming them all, but he's still giving them names. So that movement from the proper name, which only identifies one thing, to a general abstraction is a gigantic leap. So maybe that's one thing that small children, pre-verbal children have, is a more specific connection to the world.
Yeah, I think that the first time the child recognizes something it hasn't before, it's going to see it as unique. But if the child grew up in a house with multiple doors, it probably wouldn't take too long to figure that out. The first time somebody says shut the door and means a different door, I think you get it.
I have a very clear memory of when I was around 4, looking up at the sun and pointing at it and saying orange because I thought it was an orange in the sky. And little did I know that my intelligence would actually become lesser and lesser each year that passed after that point. Because intelligence isn't an accumulation of ideas, it's an ability to perceive things without buffers. And unfortunately, I have more and more buffers between myself than I did back then. And I think words are buffers. They can be wonderful buffers because they're certainly better than many of the buffers we have today. It's a matter of pick your poison. Do you want cigarettes or do you want heroin? But it's better to directly perceive things, directly perceive reality. And ultimately, what fun is it to say that the sun is a blazing ball of gas that's going to go extinct in 10 billion years? No. We need to get back to seeing it as we experience it.
Yes, exactly. That's what the direct path is supposed to help you do.
Yes, spot on, precisely.
And psychedelics, which we're getting to.
Well, yes, that's true.
I think, has anyone studied American Sign Language?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, the written word is quite a buffer because it's the reality mediated through a symbol on paper that has nothing to do with the word. And the most spoken words are also buffers like that, with the exception of onomatopoeias, right? Or I suppose mama is pretty much the same in almost every language, but most words aren't like that. It's very hard to find that connection between the sound and the thing. But in sign language, many of, maybe even most of the signs have an obvious connection, which makes them very easy to memorize. A beginner in ASL can pick up a big vocabulary in a short time.
Well, the words are performed, so it is a different thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of mime integrated into the language and facial expressions. Every once in a while someone comes up with new technology and it's special gloves that you put them on your hand and it can translate sign language into the written word on a computer screen. And anyone who's studied sign languages knows that that would be only the most basic, primitive concepts because there's too much facial expression and miming and that sort of thing.
Is there a way in ASL that you can change the way you pose or move to do the equivalent of emphasis and an intensifier, like a major disaster?
Yeah, you make the signs bigger or you repeat them several times. So a deaf person writing in English might sometimes, you see that. When we do it in English a little bit, we say, I was very, very tired, or it was a big explosion, but not all the time. In ASL, it's just all the time. There was traffic on the way to work.
Can use body language in ASL.
Oh, you
yeah.
have to, yeah.
Right. The thing, having learned some ASL a long time ago, the thing I've never seen done, but I've always really would like to see, is somebody who's really good at ASL reciting poetry.
ASL poetry is a huge thing, and it even has its own system of rhymes.
That's what I was interested in.
Right. So in ASL, two signs that are made with the same hand shape, and there's a basic alphabet of hand shapes. Two signs
Right.
made with the same hand shape rhyme, and it's used that way in poetry. A whole poem written with the same hand shape or something like that. And then dance is incorporated too, the beauty of the movement itself. ASL poetry is very beautiful to watch, even if you don't understand a word of it.
Yeah, I always enjoy watching these people that are signing when somebody's giving a speech or something. And it's amazing how fast they can move. A lot of times people giving a speech will talk fast too, but the person who's signing seems to pretty well keep up. And the way they move their hands when they come to a word they need to spell is just incredible.
Yeah, and hearing people never learn to read fast finger spelling, it's something that you miss that window in your brain development when you're young, and you can never learn it. You can learn to finger spell, but you can't learn to read lightning fast finger spelling.
But you can if you've grown up with it?
Yes, the best hearing speakers of ASL are children of deaf parents, hearing children of deaf parents who are bilingual.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. It's an externalization of consciousness, but it doesn't lose all of its inwardness. Language. Technology is an externalization of consciousness, including our memory, which I guess was first externalized on a cuneiform tablet or something, but now it's on your phone. And once you have readily accessible references, you don't need to remember. You can just look it up again.
It's a loss of, experience. Again, who wants to be on a plane for 10 hours? There's no experience on a plane, but you can get experience on a train or a boat, even if it's a long trip. Also, retention is better looking something up in a dictionary. Not to mention, I can't even count the number of times that I was looking up a word in the dictionary and ended up finding 2 or 3 other words that I didn't know that caught my attention, and they were just too good to forget. But if you look it up online, you look it up, it's very much transactional. You do it, you forget it, 15 minutes later, you're done with that word. I think all things that are worth doing are worth expending a little bit of effort over. And if you expend that effort, you might just realize that it's not just full of effort, but it's actually something that's joyful.
Yes. Well, it's a question of attention. If you can give it enough attention, you'll find what's good about it, or not so good. That happens with self-observation.
Do you want to get to psychedelics now?
Did you bring some?
I brought a question about them. Unfortunately, I don't
have the best you can do?
Maybe not, but that's what we've got today.
Well, let's take your question and see if we can get off on it.
All right. Do you believe psychedelics have a potential positive role to play in psychotherapy? How about the religious path? And if so, what role can they play?
Well, I think they have been demonstrated in clinical settings to be of dramatic assistance for people dealing with certain kinds of issues. And those issues tend to be long-term dependency, addiction, depression, and so forth. And I think there is, in the last 10 years, become a body of demonstrated clinical evidence that that's true.
Yeah. There's something about psychedelics that makes you very aware. Things are bigger than you thought before you dropped the acid.
That's right. It's hard to come back from a trip on LSD and look around and think that this is it.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say the most common form of psychotherapy that's used today, I think, is cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right.
And the idea is to clear out your patterns of thought by replacing them with other healthier patterns of thought. So we call it mind grooves. You take the same path all the time, you wear down a groove. Or it's like little kids pouring a bucket of water at the lake and the water follows the same path and the path gets deeper and deeper. And if you want to change the path, you've got to pour the water somewhere else. So cognitive behavioral therapy is laborious. It's a laborious way to change your mind grooves. And psychedelics are not the first offer of clearing out your mind grooves quickly. The old way they used to do it and still do was electroshock therapy. It was a brutal way to do it and you lose parts of your memory and everything. But I think the purpose is the same, to clear out the old ways of thinking. And that's why they say with psychedelics in psychotherapy that they can help you clear out the old mind patterns, but then you have to take care to build healthy new ones. It's not a just, okay, take this drug and now you have healthy thoughts. No, now you have the ability to build healthy thought patterns, but you still have to do it. So follow-up is so important.
With psychedelics, you learn that possibility is bigger. And I think in therapy, you would see possibility for different patterns, because who knows what you'll see.
That's almost a little too rational.
Yeah, I understand. It sounds a little flat. But, there is an expansion of the mind, as they say. And it doesn't shrink all the way down to what it was afterwards, because you have the memory of the expansion.
Right. And these are often life-changing experiences.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the possibility of being different.
Yeah, and the possibility that what you behold might not always look the same, or that it can be more alive, for instance, in some hallucinations. But you see more, whatever you look at.
Yes.
And that's a good experience.
Yes, exactly. And in terms of the religious path, it was our friend Houston Smith that first termed them entheogens.
Well, who did?
Houston.
Oh, really?
I think so. Is that right, Santa Patria?
I don't believe he's the first person to use that term, but I'm not sure who was.
They've always had a place.
That was those guys at the Harvard Circle, was it? All of their names are escaping me.
Alpert Leary and Metzner.
Yeah, I think they were
Rhonda.
the ones who used entheogens first. But I mean, to me, I always bristle at that word because it makes it sound like you can push a button and make God appear to you. And like I say, it's just the etymology of the word. So maybe I shouldn't bristle, but I'm always kind of on my guard around that idea with psychedelics that you could force God, you could generate a mystical experience automatically.
Well, yeah, you can have a mystical experience under the influence, but it isn't necessarily going to be a mystical experience, and it's not reliable.
Well, it has to, in order to be a real mystical experience, it needs to be a gift from God.
I think so.
Yeah, I would think so.
But psychedelics maybe are a gift from God, too.
That's what the Native Americans called it.
Really?
Yeah.
They call it a gift of the spirit or whatever?
I think the Aztecs did, and let's see. Peyote was called God's flesh, and the use of these substances were always within a context that supported them spiritually, much as our friend Houston talks about set and setting.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense.
I think psychedelics are sort of like death in the sense that both of them can give wildly varying experiences depending on who it is who's doing the experience and how prepared they are. There's a reason that the Tibetans do so much preparation for death, and many other ancient cultures of the Mediterranean. And in fact, in the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries, the preparations for psychedelic experiences with Kikion were similar to the preparations for death because they're both gateways. We can't force what's going to happen on the other side of either experience, but we can prepare for it. And if we prepare for it, we might just have a fruitful experience.
Yeah, the Tibetans have been pretty good about that.
Yeah, that's good. So it's something from God and something from us. And the drug itself is a gateway, an entrance into something, not the thing itself. I like that image.
And physiologically, apparently it allows lots of cross-communication from parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other. That's why you can have synesthesia and things like that. But that opening of more channels and for neural activity is really just about possibility. There are more paths a thought can take. There are more things that can be associated at once.
And there are non-drug induced ways to achieve the exact same experiences and to open the same neural pathways. People from all traditions have this, but it requires faith and it requires time and dedication and preparation. First you need the faith, then you need to go into a cave and meditate for months and wait for it to come. And it's probably going to be a more profound experience than using the drugs. But in this day and age where even the faithful are lacking in faith and where no one has time, even if they want to have time, the drugs might not necessarily be the be all and end all, but they could just give someone enough of a booster shot that they might be able to have that more profound experience later.
But it's very dangerous to try to do an end run around your spiritual preparation and and your connection with God and say, I don't have to long for God. I don't have to devote myself to him. I don't have to do this discipline, no asceticism, no work, no training, no devotion, just take this drug. I'm not saying it has to be like that, but that seems to me an extreme danger to be avoided.
Well, and maybe I should have made myself more clear. That's definitely a wrong attitude. My perspective here is that the drugs are good if it's a novice who's someone with doubt, who's like, I need some sort of confirmation of something. And it helps them, gives them some sort of certainty, pushes them out of the depression and stupor that the modern world has forced them into. And then they traverse along the traditional path. On the other hand, the person who says, no, I want the drugs to fast track myself all the way to the end, that's not going to be fruitful and they won't get it.
I see.
I would agree with that, Theta Victoria.
And one thing that I think is interesting is, I had a lot of conversations about these things in Berlin. I've never so much as taken a puff of a cigarette. I've also never actually had alcohol in my life. I have a big aversion to it that has nothing to do with Islam. But I've dabbled in just about every psychedelic that there is. And when I talk to people, all these people would use all these horrible, hard drugs, and they'd be like, I'm afraid of psychedelics.
Yeah, correct.
And that, I think, is very symbolic of where we are today. We're afraid of experience.
And we're afraid to change.
Yes.
Yeah. If you're not willing to be changed, you shouldn't take psychedelics, nor should you think that you're going to follow a spiritual path, because you have to be changed.
And you can sometimes have different experiences. Like one time, they helped me through a period of deep depression. It wasn't a spiritual experience, but it helped. It just was very practical and it helped. And I didn't have to take any of those horrible, nasty pharmaceuticals, which I would never touch with a 10-foot pole. On the other hand, there was an experience of mine where, I had a guide. It was all in a very traditional setting and everything. And I had an experience of oneness with basically the earth. It was like earth oneness. That, it was a very confirming, helpful experience because, I already know these things in my head. I know that they're alive. I know that the earth is also part of God. But to actually feel it, I'm not talking about plants getting up on two legs and walking and saying hi. But no, I felt it without words. And this helps. I mean, these things are important.
Yes. Yeah, they can confirm your intuition about the reality that you don't usually experience. And that's good. If you have a soul that's looking for God in whatever way, and you have a basic belief that, well, for me, it was basic belief that reality was always bigger than I saw, that gets confirmed, and other things can get confirmed too.
And I also would say that one doesn't have much to lose. I would say someone who comes from maybe a more traditional environment, someone that maybe has access to some of the more traditional modes of being, not that there are that many people left. I'm not talking about someone that grew up in Iran and prayed 5 times a day. That has no meaning. I mean someone that actually had connection to these modes, like someone that grew up in the Amazon rainforest or something that actually knew a shaman. But, without that, we live in this culture of rationalism and materialism. And from our earliest stages, we're socialized in such a way that we can't even understand the humanities any longer, let alone religion. And so if psychedelics can help someone get outside of that and realize that we're not these horrible machine death products, but are actually alive, maybe they can appreciate their own life and the lives of other beings and God and the earth more than they do right now.
Yeah. Well, I remember Ram Dass's account in Be Here Now about first meeting his guru, and that the guru said, "You have medicine for me." And he finally realized that, the only medicine he had were the LSD tablets that he had. And the guru asked for it, and then he asked for more. But it sounded to me like Ram Dass did not see any significant change in his behavior, but that was a lot of drugs.
Yeah, I'm interested in this question of how it changes your life, because that was always the knock on psychedelics, that I've heard people say that before, that, yeah, I had all these experiences, but it didn't change my life. But then some of you suggested that once those doors of perception are open, you at least have the memory of something bigger and deeper than what you saw, and that would change you.
It doesn't change your life. The same thing as if you have a parent who passes away, that doesn't change your life. You change your life, but the experience opens a door that allows you to make a decision. Do I take this experience and run with it, or do I stagnate?
Yeah, again, a gateway that you can walk through and see what's on the other side.
I mean, that's the thing. People always say, this or that changes my life. No, only you can change your life. You've got to grab hold of it by the reins and take responsibility for it. And, experiences are wonderful. Some of them hurt, some of them help, but it's life. And if there's something unsatisfactory in the life from the spiritual perspective, because there are material things we have no control over, but from the spiritual perspective, we have absolute, complete control. That's one of the freedoms that God gave us, and we can make these changes.
Yes, psychedelics are a tool for doing just that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in a therapeutic session, I remember reading an article about the use of psilocybin, and some people had pleasant experiences and some people had unpleasant experiences. But in a follow-up, maybe even years later, they all said it was one of the most significant things that ever happened to them in their lives, even the ones that had bad trips.
They're mostly using ketamine, and I don't know why.
Well, ketamine is not exactly a psychedelic, it's a dissociative, and ketamine is useful for depression, and I think for PTSD, I'm not sure, but it has definitely shown its value for depression. Prescribes it here.
Back to the point you were just making, I have read somewhere not too long ago that surveying the people who had done psychedelics, that psychedelic experience was in the top 5 experiences of their life for 92% of the people who had done this.
Yeah, it's an experience. It's a significant experience. Yeah, drugs.
Yeah, drugs.
Well, they were part of our path.
They were indeed. Yes, they were indeed.
And there are very, very few traditional faiths that don't have some sort of traditional use of psychedelics.
Yes, that's true too.
Arabian Islam is probably one of them. The Iranians certainly have theirs. Where do you think all the stories of magic carpet rides come from? There's an Iranian psychedelic tea. I forget the name of the herb, but there's that. Native Americans, the ancient Greek stories of the Kikion. I can go on and on and on. And there are Sufi tariqa till today in Morocco that are using a combination of music and psychedelics to induce a trance. So it's not a modern invention.
No, I think practices that have some relation to trance are well suited for that. Maybe that's not the right word, well suited. But if there's a trance, you're in an altered state. So if you practice some of these things like ecstatic dancing until you fall down and see God.
Yes, ecstatic dancing, other practices.
Sometimes though, the universe has a strange black sense of humor. Like, with Terence McKenna, he ended up passing away at an early age, had a brain tumor, and his brain tumor was the shape of a mushroom.
But I would say that there are all these practices that are considered acceptable, like fasting and ecstatic dancing and isolation and so forth. Why rule out psychedelics?
Yeah, I agree.
Why rule out psychedelics?
And if you read some of the books like Rupert Sheldrake's recent on mushrooms, fascinating things, and cacti as well. A lot of the psychedelics originate in some of the most fantastic and interesting forms of life on this planet.
Like toads?
Or soma, which actually is from a fungus that grows in cow dung. The traditional Indian...
The psilocybin mushrooms, I think, have a reputation for growing up in cow pies.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't know much about soma.
It's mentioned as far back as the Vedas.
Yes, I know. It's been around forever, but people, I think, are still debating about what it was. But whatever it was, it affected people.